So, welcome everyone. I'm Dan Rabin, and it's a great pleasure to have Professor David Blight from the Yale Department of History, and he will be talking today about Frederick Douglass in his own time and in our time. Professor Blight, thank you so much for joining us today, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming or entering Zoom, or whatever the proper term is these days. It's amazing turnout. I was talking with Daniel before this about how this book on Douglass has been out now almost 2.5 years, and for the first year and a half, I was out on the road in person many times, and now I've been on Zoom many, many, many more times. But the audiences I love speaking to, and I'm being perfectly frank with you, are just like this. Local forums associated often with public libraries. You are the best readers in the world. You are the citizen consumers of history. And I think in the last few years, there's been an awareness of some sort that's grown across America that we may need some history these days to find our footing. How did we get here? And so on. I want to first, I do want to talk about Douglass both in his own many contexts, but also reflect a little bit later on why he has such resonance today, why he's still relevant today, whether we sometimes explicitly search for it or not. But I do want to say at the outset quickly that I would never have written this book had I not encountered a private collection of Douglass manuscripts about 14 years ago now. I had no intention of writing a full life of Frederick Douglass until then. I had done my first book on Douglass out of graduate school way back in a previous decade. Short book. I had done editions of Douglass's autobiographies. I had written essays about Douglass. Douglass had been some part of virtually every other book I'd ever done. At least, he's quoted here and he's quoted there. But again, no intention of writing a full life of Douglass. That was just far too daunting, and I didn't want to. But I went to Savannah, Georgia, somewhere around 2006 or 7, to give a talk to middle and high school teachers about Frederick Douglass, which I've done many, many times. And that day I met, through my host, which was the Georgia Historical Society, a local gentleman whose name is Walter Evans. Now, apologies to any of you who may have heard me tell this story, but that day I met the most extraordinary man. Walter is an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in segregated Savannah, came north to finish high school in Hartford, and then went to Howard University as an undergraduate, and then on to the University of Michigan Medical School. And then he practiced as a general surgeon in Detroit for well over 30 years. That alone gave us something in common, because I'm from Michigan as well. I grew up in Flint, just up the road. And he and I are long-suffering, lifetime Detroit Tigers fans. But the important thing was that that day, Walter, after we had lunch, took me over to his house, which, if you have ever been to Savannah, is on Jones Street, one of those big, beautiful 4-story brownstones. And he got out on his dining room table a portion of his Douglass collection, which he started buying in the 1980s. He actually bought most of it from one other collector, but then he added to it over the years. And to make a long story short, I did not decide that day when I saw this material, oh, now I must write the great biography of Douglass. That took me months. It was too daunting. There was no road to Damascus on this. But what I realized that day and the next time I went back to visit is this had opened up a whole new possibility. The collection's core consists of 9 very large Douglass family scrapbooks, kept by principally 2 of Douglass's sons. Douglass had 3 surviving adult sons, 1 surviving adult daughter. The scrapbooks became a repository of family history, for one thing, but also an even more extraordinary repository of their father's public life, and particularly the public life of the last third of Douglass's life, from the Civil War to his death in 1895. And that tends to be the period of Douglass's life, the last third, the aging Douglass, the older man, that people have never known that much about or cared, for that matter. If Americans tended to know Douglass at all, it was the younger heroic Douglass, the escaped slave who, in his 20s becomes this internationally famous orator, who becomes this quite amazing creature of words. And but it turns out the older Douglass, the aging Douglass, and some of us on this event today can relate to this. It turns out his aging was fascinating and complicated. He became the patriarch of a huge extended family. 4 surviving adult children, 21 grandchildren. I'm sorry, 21 grandchildren. A whole variety of other hangers-on and fictive siblings who were always around him, and almost all of them financially dependent on him. It turns out the aging Douglass was also fascinating because he became a kind of political insider in Washington, D.C. after he moved there in 1872, at least with a foothold within the Republican Party. And so he becomes that kind of prototype that we've seen many other examples of now in the 20th century, even the 21st century, with Barack Obama, of the person who was once a kind of radical outsider, but becomes the political insider inside of power to some extent. And what happens to that old radical outsider when he becomes a political insider? And many, many other elements of the older Douglass came out of this Evans collection. I could tell you much more. Let me just simply say, and particularly if any of you are Yaleys, or even doesn't matter if you're Yaleys, the great news is that it took some years of difficult negotiations, but as of just over a year ago, the Evans collection was purchased by the Beinecke Library at Yale. It was moved here in a van that Walter himself rented. He wouldn't allow the Beinecke, which is a world-class, of course, research library. They have their methods and systems of transporting materials. No, sir. Walter is his own man. He rented a van, and with his wife, he drove it all the way up here from Savannah on a day in February 2020. He delivered it over to Winchester Street to the repository where they do processing. And the deal was made. It took some years because Walter is, among other things, a very good businessman. And he also waited until my book came out, which turns out was, I guess, a good strategy. Anyway, but the Evans collection, which is extraordinary, it's the most remarkable private collection about Frederick Douglass anyone has ever put together. And it is now at the Beinecke, and it is now, as of just the past month, all been digitized, and it's available to the world on the Beinecke website. So that's why I did the book. And without that, it wouldn't exist. And if any of you have copies of my book, you'll note that I dedicated the book to Walter and Linda Evans. I spent many weeks working in the coolest archive I've ever been in, which is their dining room table. They just turned over their house to me for days and days and days on end. I didn't move in. I didn't stay with them. I always stayed in a B&B up the street, or eventually I started staying in a cheaper motel downtown. But they had only 2 rules with me. One rule was don't come before 8 a.m., and that was easy. And the second rule was never put your coffee cup on the same table with the document. So I always had this little table off in the corner where I would leave my coffee cup. So those are the only rules. I could stay right through the evening. Linda and Walter be eating dinner back in their little TV room, and I'd be working. And they became dearest friends. They became my patrons. I could tell you so many stories about Walter. Anyway, that's why this book happened. Now, when you're doing biography, I think all of us who do biography do this in one way or another. You have to figure out a way to impose some order on your subject's life. They might have tried to put their life in order for you, and I can assure you this guy did. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies, then even revised the third one into a fourth and wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography. That's a person trying to impose his version of who he is on you as the biographer. But as a biographer, you have to figure out, okay, how do I shape this? How do I tell this story? What makes the most sense? And I had a few little rules with myself. I didn't know it at first, but eventually I realized it. One was that I wasn't going to play any games about chronology, although I do begin the book, as some of you know, by placing you right in 1876 at one of Douglass's greatest speeches. And then I flash right back to the beginning where he was born, out along the Tuckahoe River on the eastern shore of Maryland. Oldest narrative trick in the world. But other than that, flashback, I tell the story in the order of his life. That's how lives happen. Another little rule I had with myself is that I was never going to have a single chapter of the 33 odd chapters in this book that was only on the private life or only on the public life. It has to be both. Great modern biography now does not avoid the private life. Let's just face it. And many of you are probably voracious biography readers, and we want to know as much as we can know. There's still a form of biography of generals, diplomats, and presidents that might only be the public life, and that's still a legitimate form. But you got to do both. But the vow I made with myself was no single chapter would be just private or just public. That I was going to try to weave the two together in every chapter, whatever the subject, whatever the moment in his life, because we don't live our lives. If you're a public figure, you don't live your life only in the public any given day or only in the private. You live both of them. So I'm constantly in the book trying to fold the two together. It wasn't always easy, but that is a vow I made with myself that my readers can judge whether I managed to pull it off. Now, let's understand who Douglass was just for a minute or two. And then I do want to suggest some of the reasons that we might be here talking about him. First of all, it's important to know he was born a slave, of course, out along a Horseshoe Bend in the Tuckahoe River in a true backwater of the American slave system, the eastern shore of Maryland, in 1818, February 1818. He didn't know he was born in 1818. He'd always thought he'd been born the year before, but he never did really know. His mother was Harriet Bailey, who was one of 5 daughters of Betsy Bailey, Douglass's grandmother. But he really didn't know his mother. I mean, he only had the vaguest recollections of her. In fact, he had to practically invent her in his memory, and he invented her by finding pictures in books. He knew his grandmother better than he knew his mother. His father was a white man, but to this day, we do not know who. It was always said in Douglass's own time that his father was probably one of his 2 masters, the 2 men who had owned him in his 20 years as a slave. But no matter how hard he tried, and he tried for the rest of his life on and off to figure out his paternity, he never knew whether Thomas Auld or Aaron Anthony or someone else, like one of Anthony's sons, was his father? He never did know. And he went to great extents to try to figure it out. So by the time he is 6 years old and dropped off at the White House plantation, that big, beautiful plantation house, which is still there, built in the 1820s, 18 teens, sorry, is still there out on the Eastern Shore and now still owned by fifth generation direct descendants of Colonel Lloyd, who owned it when Douglass lived there, Colonel Edward Lloyd. When he's dropped off there at the age of 6 by his grandmother, he's an orphan. He's a thoroughgoing orphan, which is a fact worth knowing about Frederick Douglass. A lot of, you don't want to over psychologize in historical biography, but to some extent we do attempt it once in a while. Not as much as they used to in the 1970s with so-called psychobiography. But this kid was an orphan. And there are traits about him in his personality, in his habits, in his projections later that do go back to the fact that he was always looking for some sense of adult mentorship, perhaps parenting early on. He had a very difficult time with authority figures early in his life, but it doesn't mean he wasn't looking for authority that he could actually trust, and yet he had a horrible time trusting people. That's part of being a slave as well. So he grows up, first 20 years, he's a slave. Now, the luckiest break Douglass ever had is being sent from the Eastern Shore to Baltimore. If he hadn't been sent to Baltimore, we wouldn't likely have ever known about him. We wouldn't be talking about him. Of the 20 years as a slave, he spends 9 of them in the city of Baltimore. First as the playmate for his owner's brother's son, where he learns his alphabet and he learns to read from Sophia Auld, who was his mistress, white mistress. He goes back and forth to the Eastern Shore for various reasons, but when he's in Baltimore, he becomes a boy, then an early teen and a late teen in a great maritime city, a city that in the year he escaped in 1838 had about 3,000 slaves, but it had about 17,000 free blacks. It had a huge free black community. Its free black community was second only, I think, to Philadelphia. Now, this free black community didn't have any rights, any civil political liberties, but they had a community. They had a kind of alternative economy. They had their own churches. And Douglass writes about in his autobiographies 4 different churches he attended in Baltimore, which had huge influences on him. Two predominantly white churches, 2 black churches, and so on and so on. But it was that maritime city, that shipbuilding city of Baltimore that gave Douglass the chance to have an imagination, to see the world coming into Baltimore's huge harbor and then seeing it go back out to the world. It's there where he first managed to get his hands on newspapers and what resembled magazines. It's where he first could cultivate reading and even cultivate the craft of a preacher whom he modeled at these churches. Now, he escapes at the age of 20. I don't want to get into all the details of this, but that 20 years as a slave is, of course, the subject of Douglass's life in so many ways. He escapes eventually to New York and then on to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then up into Lynn, Massachusetts, and then out to Rochester, New York, where he will live all the way to 1872. But very quickly, after moving with his new wife, Anna, a free black woman he had met in Baltimore, who had the same bravery he did, by the way, in using their scheme of escape in 1838. As soon as they got to New Bedford, Massachusetts, settled into an apartment, and he got jobs down on the wharfs of that oil capital, whale oil capital, I should say, and whaling industry capital, he began to attend the local black church. It was an African Methodist Episcopal Zion church, very small church. But by the time he escapes at 20, but by the time he's 21 years old, they already had him up preaching. They discovered this kid could speak. He'd already been doing some of this back in his slavery years. And he gets discovered there by some Massachusetts abolitionists who were followers of William Lloyd Garrison. They whisked him up, took him out to Nantucket Island for a big convention for 3 days in August of 1841, where he gave, in effect, his first formal speeches to white people. And he tells us he shook in his boots when he first had to do this. But he was, it turns out, very good at it, and Garrison hired him. And from that point, September 1841, all the way to 1877, when he will get his first appointment from a Republican president, Rutherford Hayes, as the Marshal of the District of Columbia, Douglass will never make a dime in his life by any means than his voice and his pen. He never had any kind of paying job other than with his literary wits. Now, there's so much in between, but let me just say something about the full trajectory of his life and then give you my list of why we're here talking about him. And then I welcome your comments and questions. He's born out there in the Eastern Shore at a really pre-modern moment, if you think about it. 1818, you don't even really have steamboats on American rivers just yet. They're soon to be, but they're not there yet. It's well before the railroad, well before the telegraph, well before the rotary press, which will revolutionize publishing and revolutionize his life because he became a great editor and a great journalist. He edited his own anti-slavery newspaper for 16 years, the longest lasting black anti-slavery paper ever. But he's going to live all the way to 1895, almost to the end of the 19th century, to a new form of modernity. Because by then there are the first light bulbs, the first versions of these things called telephones, the first versions of these things called internal combustion engines. They have steamships by then that can cross the Atlantic in 8 days, which was considered sort of a miracle. They had laid the transatlantic cable to make telegraph possible between the continents. I mean, this was amazing. And they had the phonograph. But so far as we know, this greatest oratorical voice of the 19th century was never recorded. Now, I hadn't been around very long when he died in 95, but that somebody didn't sit down and record Douglass's voice is still a little bit astonishing, but I don't think he ever was, because I have a letter that he writes only about 3 months before he died. It's in late 1894, where he's been to dinner at a friend's house, and that friend played a phonograph recording of a minister friend of Douglass's. And Douglass goes back, sends a thank you note for the dinner. Remember that, when people sent thank you notes after dinner? He sends a thank you note for dinner, but what most of the letter is about is this magical, miraculous machine called a phonograph. And Douglass waxes on about how could it possibly be true that a human voice could live forever. And he doesn't write that letter, I don't think, if he had been recorded. At any rate, if any of you are collectors, and if you ever run across a phonograph recording of Douglass, would you call me first? I'll make you an offer, because it could be the greatest find ever about Douglass. If you ever run into that, just please give me a chance first. Anyway, now, but look what he lived through in between. This former slave who becomes this great orator, this extraordinary writer, this autobiographer, this master of the short form political editorial in his newspapers. Look what he lived through. The entire slavery experience, the coming of the Civil War and the way slavery tore the nation apart, the Civil War itself, America's Armageddon, and then the destruction of slavery through war, and then the Reconstruction era, which really is the second founding of the United States. It's the remaking of the US Constitution, which he not only celebrated, he embraced and thought the United States should export. But then he's also going to live long enough into the 1890s to see those great victories of his life all but destroyed, all but crushed by the politics of white supremacy, by terror and violence, by the retreat from the Reconstruction impulse by Northerners and by the Republican Party in the 1870s and 80s. He's one of those rarest of great reformers who actually lives to reap the victory of his cause in the middle of his life. He's in his 40s at the time of the war and emancipation. But he's going to live all the way into his 70s to see those very victories eroded and then defeated and then all but crushed. So there's an extraordinary trajectory to this life that then you have to bring some order to as a writer. Now, let me just run through my list here. I've been kind of making and remaking this list in recent times. And actually some audiences have helped me add things to this list, to be honest. You may too. One of the reasons we remember Douglass, and I think always will, is simply because of his words, millions of them. He became what I love to call in the book the prose poet of American democracy. He wasn't very good at verse poetry. He tried it, but he should have left most of it in a drawer. But he was a prose poet with few comparisons. If you're, and we've been hearing so much, haven't we, in the recent years of the threat to American democracy, the fate of American democracy. Is our democracy healthy? No, yes. Are our democratic institutions surviving? What does it mean to even have a democracy? Who have been our best prophets and spokespersons of this idea of democracy? Well, certainly Walt Whitman was one, and certainly Abraham Lincoln was one, and there were several others in the 19th century we could point to, but no one had more to say about that idea than Douglass. Secondly, what I think was a kind of unsurpassed eloquence, he explained the nature of slavery. Slavery as both a lived experience in the mind and in the psyche and on the body. But Douglass was very fond of saying that the biggest threat of slavery, to him anyway, was not to his body, not the physical treatments. He always maintained the greatest threat was to his mind, the possibility slavery had to destroy the mind, destroy the psyche, render the slave a hopeless creature. And third, Douglass came, especially by the time he became a political abolitionist by the 1850s, he expressed with a kind of terrible honesty both a love of America's basic creeds, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, but also, and he was unmatched in this, an embittered critique of American hypocrisy at violating them. Douglass loved America's creeds and at times hated the practices. And hence some of his greatest speeches, some of his greatest writings, like the 4th of July speech of 1852, which is now widely read in public places on the 4th of July. It's just one of the greatest Jeremiads in American letters. It in some ways does Jonathan Edwards one better. There is just no better statement about American political and ideological hypocrisy than that speech. What to the slave is the 4th of July. Fourthly, he became a kind of wonder of the American world. And I don't think that's hyperbole, as Joe Biden would say. Because to see and hear Douglass became a thing. And in the Evans collection in particular, because it's just chocked full of thousands of newspaper clippings. And by the way, the Douglass family in the early 1880s hired a clipping service that I didn't even know existed in the 19th century. It was called the American Bureau, so that everywhere the old man went, a newspaper clipping would somehow come back, no matter how small the town or how small the newspaper. If he spoke out in Keokuk, Iowa, there'd be a clipping from Keokuk. And it would usually have some reaction to him, announcements, or whatever. So I have dozens and dozens of these expressions by people of the first time they saw Douglass, the second time they saw Douglass, what he sounded like, what he looked like, and so on. It became a kind of an American wonder to see or hear Douglass. And by the 1870s and 80s, his physical persona, his image, that hair that was going white and the big afro and the big top hat, and especially after he appeared on the cover of Harper's magazine, or Harper's Weekly in the early 1870s, that was like being on the cover of Time magazine and like on the logo of Google or something. Everybody saw Harper's if they could read. Fifth, he was a women's rights man before there were very many. He was the only Black abolitionist who spoke at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. He was one of the few men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments. He was a thoroughgoing supporter of women's suffrage, but also women's economic rights, their right to property, their right to their property after divorce, and so on. He advocated laws for that in the state of New York. Only a minority of men supported those kinds of laws, and only a minority of men in power, for that matter. Now, he will, as many of you may know, get into a horrible dispute with the leaders of the women's suffrage movement in 1869 after the passage of the 15th Amendment, because women are not in the 15th Amendment. And the leaders of women's suffrage, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan Anthony, and others, were no longer patient. They had kind of given up their cause for the cause of Black freedom in the Civil War, and now they wanted to be included. But everybody knew you would never get a 15th Amendment out of Congress, which of course was all male, if you put women into it. And Douglass had to decide, accept it as it was, or join the women's suffrage leaders, and there would be no amendment for the Black man's right to vote. He had to make his choice. And he got attacked by Anthony and Stanton in some often, frankly, viciously racist ways during that episode. So he has a big falling out with some of the leadership of women's suffrage after 1869. And in some ways, they never fully made up. Long story. Now, sixth, or whatever number I'm on here. One of the reasons Douglass resonates so well when you get to know him at all, or you read a little bit about him, or you read a speech or two or something, is that he expressed many contradictions. And that's actually what makes biography interesting. Have you ever read a biography of anybody who was just kind of always placid and perfect? People don't generally write about them. They don't reach places of power usually if they're just placid and perfect. Maybe Calvin Coolidge was, but has anybody seen a great biography of Coolidge? Anyway, I don't even know if he was. The only president from Vermont. Now that's, I guess, chapter 1. But Douglass you can't fit him into boxes. He would change his ideas about all kinds of questions over time. And there's good reason for that. If anybody here has ever known someone who has had very little formal schooling, and Douglass never set foot in a formal school one day in his life, he is a self-taught American of the 19th century, although not entirely self-taught. There are people who helped him, got books for him, mentored him, helped edit him, and so on and so on. He had some help. But people who tend to not have much formal education but have fantastic minds tend to be these kinds of people who are sponges. They tend to make their education into the people they meet. And this I know about Douglass. Believe me, as a biographer, there are some things you never fully know, and you have to admit it. But this I know. Douglass was an intellectual sponge. If he met you, he would try to figure out what he can learn from you. What do you have? What do you know that you can help him know? And when he thought he might have learned everything he can learn from you, he might discard you, which didn't lend itself to sustaining good friendships, right? Where's this guy? I thought Douglass was my friend. He doesn't need me anymore. That was common in his life. But so he's going to change his views. He didn't grow up in the school of something. He wasn't trained in a certain institute at Yale or Harvard. He wasn't a follower of a particular teacher. Well, he was for a while with William Lloyd Garrison until he broke with him. So Douglass at the same time, for example, could be on some issues a very radical thinker. Like when he's an abolitionist in the 1850s, he becomes close to a near complete embrace of the possible uses of violence. And that's why he did get close to John Brown, although in the end didn't join him. On the other hand, other times in Douglass's life, and even within the 1850s, when he's working out all these contradictions, he could also be a classic kind of 19th century political liberal who believed that all great change should really come through law and politics. Douglass always preferred that the country and the world get changed through law and through politics, not by revolution. Because he knew, as all fugitive slaves knew, that if you have slave insurrection, it's the slaves who die. And another example of that. In season and out, before the emancipation, after emancipation, Douglass was always a preacher of Black self-reliance. Lift yourselves up. Create your own little economy if you can. Create a school if you can. Make your own churches. Don't keep asking always somebody else to provide and so on. He was a preacher of self-reliance. It makes him sound at times like a kind of modern conservative, which is why the current right wing in America loves to appropriate him, wrongly, I think. But at the same time, Douglass was a believer in activist, interventionist uses of government. How could he help being both of these? How could you help being a proponent of self-reliance as a Black leader in the 19th century, a century in which people would enslave you, then discriminate against you in 1,000 ways, kill you with mobs? How do you not believe in self-reliance? By the same token, how would slavery have ever ended without government? Douglass believed in using government to fight slavery, to defeat the Confederacy, to rewrite the US Constitution, to protect and defend the civil and political rights of the freedmen, and on and on. And this endless attempt we have in our own modern minds to make somebody fit in one camp or the other is just ridiculous. Douglass was in both. Okay, just a few others. There are times when you're reading Douglass, and I've heard this now in, I don't know, hundreds of emails from readers of this book. It's one of the most endearing things you can get as an author, is somebody writes to you and says, well, it's first of all that they've even read the book. That's a thrill. But then they say, I was reading this part in chapter whatever last night, and it sounded just like he could have said this today. about this issue today. Um, and there's a reason for that. And it has a great deal to do with the way Douglass learned to use language. And I know this can sound a little highfalutin, but I'll tell you the biggest dilemma I had in writing this book. There were many on that list. Figuring out his wife, Anna, of 44 years was certainly one. Figuring out his other relationships, another. Explaining fully his relationships with his children, which were very complicated, is another. But by far, my biggest dilemma in the process was that I wanted to put the word prophet in the title of this book, but I never was comfortable with it until I got some friends of mine who are theologians to help me know who to read. And believe me, everybody has their friends who help them write books. I had no formal theology training. I've always been fascinated with theology, and I've read some, and I still am, but no formal training. So I went to friends of mine who are. Don Shriver, who used to be president of Union Theological in New York, praise the Lord, is still with us, but Don got me reading Walter Brueggemann, among others, who are famous Old Testament scholars, because Frederick Douglass was absolutely steeped in the Hebrew prophets. There is no major Douglass speech that doesn't invoke at least one of the Hebrew prophets, and some of the speeches invoke several. In fact, in the famous 4th of July speech, there is 6 or 7 uses of biblical passages. 3 of them are from Isaiah, 2 are from the Psalms, and then, I don't know, there's one Jeremiah and one Ezekiel. He grew up reading the Old Testament. He learned his voice. He learned how to use language in the King James cadences of the Old Testament. So I had to learn how to read the Old Testament and understand the stories. Another friend of mine got me reading Robert Alter, among other scholars of the Old. In fact, Robert Alter is now the famous interpreter of, translator of the Bible into a wholly new version. But most importantly, it was a rabbi here in, and I'm not Jewish, but I became very close friends with a rabbi here in New Haven named Jim Ponit, who used to be head rabbi at Yale, and then he retired. He started attending classes. He attended my class with his wife, Elena, and he began to learn of my dilemma when I was writing the book on Douglass. We went to lunch and dinner and so on. He got me reading Abraham Heschel, the greatest Jewish theologian of the 20th century. And it was from Heschel and others that I began to get comfortable finally with just what is a prophet. What do we use that term for? We should use it sparingly. There aren't very many, but there have been a few. And it was Heschel, among others, who said the following. It was quotes like this, and I do quote this in the book. In fact, I quote Heschel at least 3 times in the book to reinforce what I'm doing. Heschel's famous book, he wrote many, but his famous book is called The Prophets, which is a 600-page analysis of who and what were the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, or of the Hebrew Bible, as Jews would say. And it's Heschel who helped me get my hands on what is a prophet. The prophet is human, wrote Heschel, I'm quoting, yet he employs notes 1 octave too high for our ears. He experiences moments that defy our understanding. He is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of our mind. Often, his words begin to burn us where our conscience ends. An assaulter of our minds. That's Douglass. A prophet, writes Abraham Heschel, was or is that person who can find the words sometimes to explain a great pivot in history, a great tragedy in history, a catastrophe, a triumph, that the rest of us just can't find. And the more and more you read Frederick Douglass, there are just these passages, these paragraphs, these riffs where you say, oh my God, he captured that. Oh my God, look at that. It's one of the reasons there are whole collections of Douglass aphorisms. You can even buy little books now of Douglass aphorisms. So I finally got comfortable with that word prophet. I not only put it in the title, but I began to realize I had a theme, maybe a central theme, that I tried to occasionally come back to throughout the book. Now, last point I'll make is that we're here talking about Douglass. He resonates in our time because look at the issues he faced and dealt with, and look at the issues we're facing now. On the personal level, there was this experience of slavery and racism. No one analyzed what slavery and racism was in the 19th century as much as or as well as Frederick Douglass. Then there's this question of, so what is an American? What is an American? Well, before the 14th Amendment, that meant, generally speaking, a white person. There was no national definition. There were only a few state definitions. There was no national definition of citizenship. So what is an American citizen? Well, the 14th Amendment finally in 1866 gave us a definition. It meant a person born here, birthright citizenship. It meant that person had now equality before law. The most important phrase in the second Constitution, the Civil War Constitution, or the Reconstruction Constitution. What is an American? What is a citizen? Who gets to be an American? Douglass had this vision, what he called the Composite Nation. And one of his greatest speeches is an 1869 speech called The Composite Nationality, where he spins this whole vision, rooted in the Reconstruction Constitution now, at least for a while, until it began to fall apart, rooted in this idea of all the peoples of Earth, all religions, all races, all backgrounds, all ethnicities, all coming together and living under one constitution, and all of them living under a creed of equality before law. Imagine that, Douglass said. We have a chance to create it. And it's exactly what we're still trying to create. How are we doing with that? 150 some years later. And then thirdly or fourthly, take the question of the US government. Take the question of our federalism, the relationships of the states to the federal government, a constant battle, an eternal battle in our system, because it's baked into the Constitution. It is. It's all over the Constitution, the proper rights of the states, proper rights of the federal government, although there's ample ambiguity such that we keep fighting about it. Douglass endlessly analyzed this problem of powers of the federal government, powers of the states, and what they ought to be. He had his own take on all of that, as did most radical Republicans. And lastly, there is no better voice in the 19th century, at least, about this question of not just who is an American, what is an American citizen, but what ought to be the American story. What ought to be the narrative we live by. Douglass spent that last third of his life after emancipation, after the Civil War, trying to preserve a kind of abolitionist meaning and memory of the Civil War, which he saw as the reinvention of the United States, the remaking of America, 80 some years into its existence. And today, what are we fighting about? Endlessly. What is the proper narrative of American history? Who gets to control it? Are we a nation of massive diversity that we celebrate, that we can live with together under an umbrella of law? Or ought we be a nation like we were some other time when America was great, in the 1950s, in the 1930s, in the 1890s, or some other place in our past we want to choose. We will forever, as long as there's a thing called the United States, we will forever fight this battle about who gets to control that narrative of who belongs in this place. Douglass never stopped writing about that, including in his very last great speech, which was, he first crafted in 1893, and he gave it all through 1894, right up almost until the time he died in early 95. And that was his speech on lynching, on violence, on terror. It was called The Lessons of the Hour, in which he tried to explain why Black Americans were being burned at the stake, lynched from trees, murdered by mobs. To some people, that felt inexplicable, but it wasn't to Douglass. He analyzed it in three parts. He analyzed it through what he called three excuses. It's a brilliant speech. He's an old man. He's 76 years old when he's giving that speech. He's already got heart disease. His hands trembled. He was tired all the time. He died in 95 of a massive coronary and probably was suffering from, bad arteries for quite a while. In fact, in the middle of trying to finish my book, I had triple bypass and valve replacement. I had the whole heart surgery thing, and I learned a fair amount about cardiology. I learned that it was invented right after Douglass died. There was no cardiology in 1895, but there was in the next year. At any rate, we're here talking about Douglass because this question of race and slavery has been the central American dilemma. In some ways, its legacies still are. And there are just few other voices like Douglass that have penetrated these questions. I come to every talk I give loaded with quotations from Douglass, but I try to spare you that until you ask about something. But I'll end with one little simple quote. When he was trying to finish or put the ending on his second autobiography, he writes the first one in 1845, the little one. He writes his second one in 1855 called My Bondage and My Freedom. It's his long form masterpiece. It's 440 pages long. It's a much more political autobiography because it's the middle of the slavery crisis of the 1850s. But when he has to finish the book, here's how he finished it. He said, as long as heaven allows me to do this work, I will do it with my voice, my pen, and my vote. I've always loved that quote, not only because as a writer, I love to look at how other writers fashion, beginnings and endings and so on, but because those three things are about all any of us have in this democracy. If you have great wealth, you have other kinds of power. We know that, but most of us have voice, pen, and vote, and most of us don't have the pen. But it's so interesting to me that he added that word vote at a time when most African Americans couldn't even get near to the right of voting. He could at that point, because in New York State, you could vote as a Black man if you owned $250 worth of property. You didn't have to if you were white. My voice, my pen, my vote. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, but I wanted to lead off with one question, and that is, we obviously haven't solved the problem of racism in this country, and it's not clear to me, at least, that anybody has a straightforward or even a path to approach that question. My question is, do you know of any place in the world where a society has suffered from a problem of racism and has successfully surmounted it? And are there lessons there for the United States?
Oh, wow. What a great query that is, Daniel. The best we can do with that kind of question is to look at other modern examples of societies that have had to go through transformations. South Africa, for example. Now, it's a glass half full or a glass half empty story about South Africa. They have succeeded at some things in their recent fight against apartheid and well, by and large, the end and destruction of apartheid and the recreation of a new nation in South Africa. They haven't solved everything, not especially the problem of poverty and economic inequality in South Africa. They tried, of course, a certain method of repair, which was truth and reconciliation. They traded truth for justice. Now, this may seem odd to some, but I do think it's worth thinking about modern Germany. Again, there are holes in this theory, of course, but Germany, the site of, if we have to compare, the greatest crime by a nation, certainly in the 20th century, and one of the greatest ever. The Third Reich, the Holocaust, the Second World War. Germany, though, developed, it took time, but Germany developed into, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, one of the most robust democracies in the world. I spent a year living there in the early 90s, right after the wall went down. I had a Fulbright at the University of Munich. I taught in Germany for a year, traveled all over the place. At that moment that East and West were trying to, combine, it was a very complicated time. But there have been times in the last 2 to 3 decades when you could point to Germany as, in some ways, the best functioning democracy on the globe. And yet, look what they had come out of. Look what they had come from. Now, there were reasons Germany had to become so democratic, because the whole world was watching. The Cold War made them, so to speak, as it did in Japan. I mean, Japan is a very different culture, but Japan became, by and large, a robust democracy, and God knows, a robust economy out of what it had been, which was this fascist state that conquered most of Asia. So I don't know. I hesitate to say that, unfortunately, these examples are those countries that created world wars, were completely destroyed, including by 2 atomic bombs dropped by the United States on Japan, and in effect, out of utter and complete defeat, managed to create democracies. Now, again, we got to be careful. I love these kinds of comparisons. This is one of the reasons historians live to talk about these things, but it's easier to talk about these things like over a beer than it is to try to write it down. But the United States has never had anyone from outside coming in to make us revise our institutions. Germany did. The Cold War forced certain kinds of regimes of change onto Germany, and for that matter, onto Europe. Because of the threat of the Soviet Union, Germany became the most important place on the planet in the 1950s. Same is true of Japan, because of China on its border, right? Now, if the United States had had a China or Soviet Union on its border somehow in the wake of our Civil War, would we have developed out of that somehow differently? I don't know. I mean, we can only twist history inside out so many ways. But, some people like to point to Ireland, although, God, Northern Ireland is blowing up again in Belfast, so I got to be careful with that example. But some people have looked to Ireland as a place that had a century and more of troubles, of terrible violence, of sectarian violence, religious violence, Protestants against Catholics, which is sometimes for some Americans almost impossible to understand. I never understood it until I spent a week in Belfast once and had my tires on my rental car slashed. Anyway, long story, I'll spare you. But some have pointed to Ireland that they finally found ways to reconcile sectarianism and move on. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. There are other possible examples. Some have even said Vietnam. When you look at the generations of war that Vietnam, well, first there was the two Vietnams, and now there's, I guess, one Vietnam, but that whole Vietnam, Laos, that whole area, 30 years of war, and out of it came now, I wouldn't say necessarily a prosperous nation, but a relatively stable nation. What are we saying here, though? That most of these recreated democracies that have perhaps worked have come out of terrible war, collapse, catastrophe, disaster, forcing the remaking of something. I mean, one of the great dilemmas we've had in this country, and I wrote an entire book on this called Race and Reunion, the Memory of the Civil War, about 20 years ago, is that our most divisive experience, our Civil War, which slaughtered over 700,000 people and tore the country apart and forced its remaking, there was nobody coming in to force the United States, the new United States, to reconcile in this way, that way, or that way. The only way it could happen in America to reconcile our Civil War was through politics and through the politics of memory, and that meant the racial politics of memory in this country. You hate to keep admitting it every day, and it's what I tend to do, but race is somewhere at the bottom of, or at the base of, almost every social issue and dilemma we have in this country. And we've seen it again with the pandemic, the way it revealed the racial disparities by which people had to experience this. Well, are still experiencing this. It's not over, is it? But it's a great question to think in comparative terms about. And I would say this too, Daniel, in the academy now, in graduate programs like at Yale and the others among the best programs, I'm not sure this kind of comparative history is really in vogue anymore, which is a shame. And there are reasons for that, and I don't want to go into it all. But this kind of big, robust thinking about, comparative democracies is happening in the social sciences, I think, more than it tends to among historians. And that's a shame. So.
Well, thank you. We have a question here. Did Douglass take a position on reparations? And if not, what do you think he would have said on the topic?
Yeah, it's interesting how rapidly that question comes up these days. Boy, does it ever. I'll preface it by saying I'm currently, for my sins, chairing Yale's version of a study, a pretty robust study of Yale's 320 years of relationships to slavery. I have a whole working group working on this, 6 research assistants, et cetera, et cetera. But every time we hold a public forum, the question about what'll be the reparations almost comes up first. And my answer usually is, I have no idea. That's not my pay grade. That's why we have presidents and boards. But Douglass on this idea of repair, oh God, of course he favored it. I mean, but I'll say this. Douglass much preferred in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, in those 2 and 3 decades after slavery, he much preferred that the United States live up to what it had already created in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It had created a new constitution. He much preferred that constitution simply be enforced. He thought the best repair you can have is enforce the law. Enforce the 14th Amendment fully, create equality, create schooling, public schooling, across the land, make the public school, you know, the way of the future. He was all for that. Now, would he have opposed some kind of financial repair for the, you know, the starving, struggling freed people of the South? No, he wouldn't have opposed it. On the other hand, he got himself caught up in some pretty difficult arguments about this. For example, over the so-called Kansas Exodus of 1878-79. This is after the boll weevil epidemic or pandemic, or whatever you want to call it, infestation, had hit across the South. It was killing off the cotton crop. Sharecroppers were not producing anything to survive on across the South by then. And a whole lot of poor Black people, especially in the lower Mississippi River Valley, which is a very dense population, just got it in their minds they were going to move out to Kansas. There was kind of a Kansas dream. There was going to be land in Kansas. There was going to be more freedom in Kansas. Douglass and most Black leaders in the country supported it. Douglass opposed it. Douglass went out on a limb by himself and said, no, stay where you are. Fight it out where you are. Yeah, you know, he was a little out of touch on that issue. And he got into some ferocious fights with other Black leaders over this in the press and on platforms. But Douglass had very strong views about such things as statehood for the District of Columbia, for example, in the 1880s. He was all for that. He saw no good reason why the District of Columbia shouldn't be a state. We're still fighting that one, aren't we? Will it ever happen? It seems so logical in some ways, but it's politics. Of course it's politics. But I will say Douglass never came up with his own, like the Douglass plan of reparations. There are a couple of places in a few of his speeches where people have pointed to and said, aha, you see, he was for reparations because look what he's saying there. But the problem with this issue of reparations is it gets used for so many purposes and reasons. It means 100 different things to 100 different people. It has tort models, it comes out of law. It has symbolic models, which usually takes the form of memorials and monuments. And it has financial models. But Douglass in his lifetime never particularly worked out his own plan for that, I have to admit.
The other thing about reparations is how you look at it. That is it justice to be done for a past injustice, or is it a way to solve the problem going forward? So I think that has, it's very complicated and has a lot of different.
Is a major policy, a major reform policy that can deal with inequality today, like the part of the recent stimulus package that they say will cut child poverty by 50%. I mean, I don't know the substance of where that number comes from, but if you can actually do that, is that reparation? Is that repair? Well, it's certainly a form of repair. And the inequality is disproportionately for Black and brown people, but it's also poor white people too. But there is a politics to the reparations question that, of course, will never go away.
We have Mary Rita Kalelia. Can you have your hand raised? Can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Mary.
Just taken by surprise.
Yeah, you caught her. Maybe she had her hand up and didn't know it.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, there's a discussion here. Did Douglass come to New Haven? If so, how often? And who hosted him in speeches, newspaper, or other evidence? And Aaron Good added he spoke to Black troops.
Oh, yeah.
In New Haven in 1864.
He sure did. That particular speech was remarkable. We actually don't have a full text of it. We have excerpts. He spoke right out, where the big oil tanks are. It's in, I think that's East Haven there, isn't it? There's a park. If you just go out Chapel Street, all the way until, not until it ends, but you go over that bridge, that little drawbridge in East Haven, and there's a park on your right, and there's a beautiful memorial to a Black Civil War regiment, a Connecticut regiment that was formed and disembarked from that very site to go off to war in 1864. Douglass came to town to speak to that regiment before they departed. And every summer when I do teacher institutes, we always take the teachers, we load them on a bus, we take them out there, we gather them around. I read some of the excerpts of the speech Douglass gave there, and then I read some other excerpts of other speeches he gave to Black troops. And it's really a wonderful place to do that sort of thing. It's very easy to find. Just get on Chapel Street in New Haven and go east. You can't miss it. He also spoke at the Institute Library. If any of you are familiar with that old library down on what is also Chapel Street, it's the second floor library. They say he spoke there. I don't have any particular document that proves that, but I'm willing to believe them. Why not? He also disembarked from here in New Haven Harbor 2 or 3 times on steamers to various places. I remember seeing those records. But he had otherwise, he went through New Haven endless times on the railroad, of course, because you can't go between upper New England or Boston on your way to New York or further south without going through New Haven. The train line then is the same as the train line now. So he was through here many, many times, hundreds of times, no doubt. And he also had a very dear friend, close associate, Ebenezer Bassett, who may ring some bells for some people, who was a New Havenite and is buried in Grove Street Cemetery, as a matter of fact. Ebenezer Bassett was the first African-American ambassador to Haiti. Douglass was actually the third. Douglass's third great appointment from the federal government came in 1889 when he was made U.S. minister to Haiti. But Bassett had been in that position before him, 15 years earlier. And when Douglass went to Haiti, Douglass didn't speak French, and Bassett did. So he got approval to take Bassett with him as his secretary, because Bassett was fluent in French. And Bassett was an almost lifetime resident of New Haven. So I've imagined at least they must have met here a few times, although I don't remember any particular evidence of that. He never spoke officially at Yale, so far as I can tell. If I ever find that, though, I'll make some fuss about it.
We have a correction by a Branford resident that the park is in Fairhaven.
Well, that's Fairhaven, not East Haven. I always get the havens mixed up, Sorry, it's in Fairhaven. All right, thank you. I appreciate that. I never know when I'm in North Haven, Fairhaven, East Haven, or anyway, West Haven.
Come to Branford, you'll know you're here for sure.
Well, that's true. Yeah, Branford I get, but.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think this is a good stopping point. It was fantastic, and we had a lot of people, and I think if we could all put our hands together for you.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thanks to everybody for coming this afternoon. It's great to spend a piece of Sunday with you, and I spoke a little bit too long, probably. I hope I didn't blot out any of your good questions, but I really enjoyed this, and thanks for inviting me.
Okay. Thank you again, and thanks to everyone for joining the Branford Forum today.
Take care now. Thanks.
Bye.